Hello everyone, back with a quick video about HOCs, HOCs versus render props. This is a new thing that's come out in the last couple weeks. There's been a lot of debate and a couple great articles online. So I wanted to quickly touch on what these two things are in React and when you might use one versus the other and what the benefits, some pros and cons are. So first, I'm going to put this code up. You can go ahead and grab it and play around with it. What is a higher order component? So a higher order component comes from the root of it is in functional programming where you have higher order functions. A higher order function is a function that takes a function and returns a new function. So it's kind of a way to chain together your functions. It's like the core of functional programming. Higher order component is a function that takes a component as an argument and returns a component. Now this confused me a little bit when I was getting into React and learning about HOCs because functions can actually be components. So in a way, this is the same as higher order functions, where it's a function that takes a component that could be a function and returns a component that could also be a function. So it's all kind of functions under the hood, but a higher order component could take the form of a class component as well. So this example here is a really simple example. All I'm doing, this is my base component, my leaf node component. It's a div that shows if it has an error or not, and it just shows hello world. And what I want to do is kind of render this this leaf component and not have to worry about where the validation logic is. So I'm importing this is valid into my my component, and to bootstrap this component with the validation so that I have a validated hello, I'm using an HOC. So this, as you can tell, is a function, as we said, that takes a component, and then it's returning an inline function component. So it takes a component and returns a component. In this case, it's just a function. So what it has to return is something that renders the component that you passed in. That's why it's like a higher order component. So I could have put the div in here too with the validation logic, but I chose to only do the logic here. This is the core of what this higher order component does. Checks if some value is greater than 10. Most components have a lot other stuff going on, like our styles HOCs or other helper HOCs. Maybe it provides layout for your component. So that's how that works. Then I have an app that just renders that, passing the value in. And we can see that this works if we go to the browser and see that it just adds a green border, and if it's invalid, that is less than 10, it should change. Had a little bit of a mistake there where I wasn't actually destructuring out the props. I was just trying to do this, but obviously this is going to be an object, and an object will always be truthy, and so that was valid. So destructure that out, and we can see that that works. So let's look at the equivalent of this using a render prop pattern, or a function as a child pattern is what it's also called. I highly recommend you check out this pull request for the Facebook documentation that I think Michael Jackson authored that. There's a lot of really good discussion from industry leaders in there, and it's a good way to learn about the pros and cons and why render props are, in a lot of cases, I'd say in most cases, better than reaching for a higher order component. So what is a render prop? A render prop is simply a component that takes a property that is meant to be used to render something. It's very generic, and it uses less components than an HOC. So let's take a look at our same example. We have an app, and that app has this validated hello, and this is our render prop component. So in this case, it is just using a function as the children. The children of this component is a function that, when called, will render out our component, our hello component. So you can see the breakdown is a little bit different. Instead of passing in the HOC, instead of passing in the component to a function, what we're doing is passing a function into our HOC. And then the HOC can, or not HOC in this case, a render prop function, it can do what it wants. I could render something here and then render the children. I could take multiple render props and render them in sequence. really there's a lot more that you can do with, well, there's not more that you can do, but you can kind of think about the code in a nicer way when you just have a function that's getting passed in to render rather than a component that you have to render. Another big benefit of this method is that you see exactly what the things that are coming into your component are. So the scope, anything inside of this function, if I had other components in here that also wanted to check is valid, or if I had some other parameters here, anything in the scope of this function is available for me to use. In HOC, it takes a little bit of restructuring to get all of the values that you want, and if you have multiple HOCs, like a styles thing and I don't know, uppercase thing, as soon as you start chaining together some of these HOCs, it's not clear once I get to my component where each of these values is coming from. With render props, you see that this is simply a function that's going to take some values and it's going to render out your component. So that's a brief introduction to HOCs and render props. There's a lot more that you can look up online. There are definitely a lot of articles historically on HOCs and when to use them and how to use them. The idea of render props or a function as a child is a fairly new concept, but it's generally already being preferred in the community. So I highly recommend, before you reach for an HOC or decide to use an HOC, see if you can switch it to a render prop or instead use a render prop pattern. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.